Welcome to today's webinar, Looking Back and Looking Ahead, 4 Decades of Lessons Learned from Main Street and Beyond, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is Looking Back and Looking Ahead, 4 Decades of Lessons Learned from Main Street and Beyond. You can also search for event number 9214842. So to get started, our speaker today is Mary Means. Mary is best known for leading the team that created the National Main Street Center. More than 1,600 towns and historic neighborhood corridors in more than 40 states have successfully used the Main Street approach to bring people back to their historic cores. Mary was a Labe Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Her planning firm has helped communities and other public interest organizations with strategic plans that achieve strong public support. Her work has been honored by the American Planning Association with its 2018 Planning Pioneer Award and by the National Trust for Historic Preservation with the 2020 Crown and Shield Award, the highest honor in historic preservation. Mary is also the author of Main Street's Comeback and How It Can Come Back Again, which was published in 2020. Following her presentation, Mary will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'm going to turn it directly over to Mary. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Michael. And hi, everybody. It's great to sort of see you on a day like this. Can you see me? Great. I think you can. John, Michael, am I being seen?
You're good to go, Mary.
All right, I'm going to get going then. Well, as I'm looking back on my career, I've been really blessed to have seen much of the country and to have worked with some of the finest urban designers, economists, and architects, and for some terrific clients, plus a few maybe not so great ones. Along the way, I've made mistakes, and I've mostly learned from them, and I've intuitively absorbed a lot from all of this. Today, I want to raise up a couple of these learnings, but first, I want to give you an overview of the Main Street Revitalization movement and its beginnings. Before we start, let's find out a little bit about you.
So here's the first poll. Please check all that apply. I am a planner in an agency, an elected or appointed official, an academic, a consultant, or a developer. And if you need to, you may need to exit from full screen mode to respond to it. We'll leave it open.
John, are you guys able to hear me well? Because there's someone saying that the sound is garbled.
Yeah, that's not in the system. It's there's a user guide that's listed in the welcome message that everyone should look
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So we'll leave this open for another second or two.
All right.
So the response here is 63% are planners and agencies, 27% consultants today, 9% elected and appointed officials, 7% academics, and 2% are developers.
Fantastic. So now we will go on. I want to go back to the beginning. It was the 1970s, and I was in my 20s. My job with the National Trust was to foster the growth of historic preservation in the Midwest. Traveling around its 10 states, I was meeting advocates, some of them, and skeptics. Those included nearly everyone in power. And I discovered that while there were fine architectural landmarks throughout the Midwest, the most striking and neglected historic resource was the town center, its Main Street. For the most part, the historic preservation world focused on integrity, meaning original design, overlooked these most vernacular buildings, yet the whole of its Main Street with the 19th and early 20th century buildings was much more than its part. But Main Street was so familiar to people, and its deterioration had been so gradual that it was taken for granted. However, times were changing fast, and business was moving to highways or to shopping centers, and it was draining the life from Main Street. Across the Midwest, shopping centers, this one's in Rapid City, South Dakota, were popping up like mushrooms after the rain, and town centers were slowly dying. If a town's leaders wanted to do something about it, they needed information, examples of how other towns have done it. Keep in mind when this was taking place, not our own times. It was well before the internet, decades before the internet. Towns were really isolated, and the very prospect of bringing their downtowns back was just daunting. Yet some towns tried. They would turn to the few available examples as they were viewing them. Disneyland, of all places, was one of them. It opened in 1971 with Adventureland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland, and Main Street. One can imagine visitors from the Midwest returning home and seeing their Main Street differently. So at one end of the spectrum of do something about it were these paint up, fix up schemes. Downtown looked better, but how were the businesses inside the buildings doing? At the other end of the change spectrum was to remove the old buildings and start over. Urban renewal funds, federal urban renewal funds, made it possible. A number of towns took this redevelopment route. Rockville here in Maryland was one of them, building ultimately a fortress that then had to be removed. Winooski, Vermont, in the picture, leveled an entire block, one whole side of its main shopping street, to make ready for the hoped-for developer. It's kind of akin to the cargo cult of after World War II in the Pacific Southwest. Bulldozer runway, stand beside it with Macy's and Marshall field bags, and maybe a developer will land. In the middle of this were, go back. I don't know why I'm getting script up here. Hang on patiently. Thank you. We'll skip that. Slip covers were another way of covering up and modernizing. And I have some pictures up here that don't seem to be doing very well, that were hiding behind them some really fine buildings, but they too become dated and shabby. So this was really a time before adaptive use became common, and there were very few examples. So there were only two of us in the trust office and very few local preservation organizations. So it was pretty clear we weren't going to be able to get ahead of this, get any headway, if we couldn't address two related issues. First, Town centers, main streets, were being demolished or left behind as relics. If we were going to make preservation work, we had to find ways for communities to save them and to bring them back to life. Second, and directly related to this, advocates for preservation were passionate, but they were seldom in power. They viewed us as seeing the world through curatorial eyes, seeking architectural perfection, and they knew that would be expensive. We had to make believers of those in power, and the best way to do that was to make preservation work, preservation matter to them. Who were they? Business people. If we could make preservation work downtown, maybe we could address both of these overarching issues. So with the naivete of youth, we set out to do this with the Main Street project. We would work in 3 towns to learn what worked. Then we'd hold conferences, write a book, and make a film. And we do all of this in 3 years. We were in our 20s. And we would document it so we could prove, as our tagline here says, that you could have economic development within the context of historic preservation. The National Endowment for the Arts believed in us, and they awarded us $50,000, their maximum, to get started. That was probably the most highly leveraged grant NEA ever gave. A benevolent manufacturer put up the rest, paying for the rest of it, including the towns in the film. We competitively chose 3 towns from the 70 that applied. They were all in the Midwest. Their issues were common to many towns. Hot Springs was a small tourist town in the Black Hills. Galesburg, Illinois was larger. It was a railroad hub. And Madison, Indiana was a gem of a 19th century market town on the Ohio River. We put a National Trust staffer in each of them to coordinate the efforts and to learn. From the experience in the towns, we learned a lot. We distilled it into easily understood action framework. Towns needed to work simultaneously in 4 areas: organization, promotion, design, and economic vitality. You know it today as the Main Street approach, the 4-point Main Street approach. We learned that a lots of little projects can really add up to forward motion and an uptick in business. We also learned the vital ingredient was the presence of an energetic, savvy Main Street manager to orchestrate the volunteers. And we learned the power of story or vision. The image of the whole town is the underlying purpose of the 4-point approach. The town's own self-image, not just what it projects to others, what it believes itself to be inside. The common wisdom of the time was, head out, downtown is dead. Spoken or not, this was the inner voice in towns and cities across the country. It has been said that the Main Street project brought a new narrative. No, it isn't. It's the heart of your community, and you can do something about it. And here's how. From the very start, the media jumped on it. It was a natural David and Goliath story. All 3 networks, there were only 3 then, did features on it, and the Associated Press syndicated stories spread to many, many local newspapers. There used to be such things. The film, Main Street, came out in 1979, and it immediately became a Rotary and Kiwanis lunchtime hit. Soon, hundreds of towns were calling and writing letters to the National Trust. No email yet. The National Trust had never seen anything like it. Nothing it had ever done had ever gained this much traction, and it was happening well beyond the Midwest. But the project was slated to end in a few months. Instead of riding off into the sunset at the end of 3 years, we managed to attract the funding to take the Main Street approach to scale, trying it out in 6 states, each with 5 towns. Thus was born the National Main Street Center. In choosing states, our hope was that states would become the platform for networks of strong Main Street towns, so that when the National Trust got out of the Main Street business, they would be there. And they are there 40 years later. Over the last 2 years, I've been thinking a lot about how all this came about, why it worked, why it spread, and how it's endured for 40 years. I'd left the world of Main Street in the mid-1980s, and I'd been quite preoccupied running a small but mighty planning firm. But when the American Planning Association honored me with the Planning Pioneer Award in 2018, I looked up and saw the screen at the awards luncheon. I was absolutely floored. I was blown away by the spread of it and by the economic impact of it all. We'll go back. It's a story that's actually flown under the radar of mainstream economists and preservationists. So I decided to write a book about it. I called it Main Street's Comeback. As I was finishing it, the pandemic changed everything, including the book. It's now titled Main Street's Comeback and How It Can Come Back Again. And it came out last December. The damage of the pandemic is absolutely profound. Beyond the tragic death toll, it is truly an existential crisis, as we all know, nowhere more so than on the nation's main streets. But most main streets have weathered existential crises before. Think of the Great Depression, with bread lines passing boarded up stores all over the country. Think of the flight to the suburbs and to those spreading regional shopping centers. Main streets even survived Amazon so far. And now more than 1,600 of them have active Main Street organizations. It was amazing to see how quickly most of them pivoted to help their small businesses and each other. From hoisting the flag of community spirits, to helping with PPP applications, to coaching scores of small retailers and restaurants as they ventured online. Only about 60% of small businesses had websites a year ago. Main Street organizations were able to be the community advocate for changing policies and practices quickly. Particularly those that would enable small businesses to operate outdoors. Many of these have been so well received that many communities are planning to make them permanent. Don't get me wrong, I know that many small businesses have not made it through. And the losses, particularly the ones that have been local landmarks for generations, are heartbreaking. There are vacancies, but there's also hope. Thousands of volunteers have spent years turning their downtowns around, and they're not going to stand by and let them die. They've already swung into action everywhere. And there are resources available to help guide them. One of the best resources I've seen so far is this one, which is called First, Next, and Later. Kennedy Smith wrote it, and she ran the Main Street Center for many years. It's particularly good on things communities can be doing now to have a smoother road ahead. Updating downtown property inventories, for instance, to have a current file of available retail spaces for business recruitment. Revisiting land use plans and zoning that give unfair advantage to chain stores that compete with downtown, and much more. And despite the losses, there are emerging opportunities. There will be entrepreneurs starting new businesses, there already are, in some of these vacant storefronts. And realtors are reporting strong interest in relocation to cool towns, particularly the ones with good schools, recreational amenities, and especially high-speed internet. Thank heavens we're including high-speed internet as vital infrastructure. Already, Iowa is fielding scores of calls from people who decided they can work remotely from someplace with a lower cost of living. The entrepreneur who started the tech incubator above chose downtown Cape Girardeau, Missouri, because its downtown organization was proof to it that the town's people can work together and get things done. 40 years ago, a tiny band of determined preservationists set out to find a way for Main Street's historic buildings to earn their keep. Little did we know that it would lead to a powerful vehicle for economic recovery after COVID. Together, Main Street's 1,600 towns and 40 states are an invisible system for recovery. It's time to lift that up and make it visible. This is the resilient network that's poised for regeneration. Each of these organizations is a regenerator. That's the term used by urban economist Bruce Katz, formerly of Brookings, to name the vital engine of recovery. Keeping this web together and strengthening it is part of the COVID economic recovery legislation that's just been passed. Why? Because, as Kat puts it, the notion that a quick revival of Main Streets will be driven by millions of individual small businesses acting on their own defies the laws of science. He and we know that recovery is inextricably linked to the recovery of places, not just small businesses. It's not going to help a succeeding small business if there are 4 other vacancies on the block. The vital ingredient is the presence of these regenerators. And right now, many of these vital institutions themselves are experiencing some financial distress. Thus, the critical need for federal funding to keep the regeneration web together. It seems to have wide support. We live in a fractured and divided nation. We all know that. It's been very stressful. There are Main Street offices in red states, in blue states, in purple states. Main Street's nonpartisan. It belongs to everybody. And it takes inspired leadership to keep it that way, to enable it to remain the heart of the whole community. In that, we can take heart. And now let's do a second poll.
Okay, it's now up there. Pick only one. My community has a Main Street organization, a business improvement district, a volunteer-run downtown organization, or my community lacks a revitalization organization. We'll give you all another 40 seconds or so to respond. And thanks to those who are. You need to exit full screen mode to respond. Please do.
While we're doing that, I'm wanting to share with you that nearly everything I've learned about planning, urban design, transportation, housing, market economics has been from working with scores of public interest clients, towns, cities, counties, nonprofit institutions. When I once said to a distinguished colleague that I had no formal training in urban design, he answered, "You've done better. You've learned in scores of urban design studios." So on to life after my Main Street years.
Okay, so the response to this one was 35% with business improvement districts, or has one, 27% Main Street, 21% don't have anything, and then 17% have a volunteer-led organization.
That's terrific. So I wanted to share with you a few lessons. I could ramble on all afternoon about all the places I've been, all the things I've done, all I've learned, but I want to focus on just a couple of key learnings. And I want to give you a trigger warning. Those of you who dislike process, who gravitate towards more tangible, more technical subjects, you're just going to have to bear with me. My public engagement assignments have ranged from who cares, why pay attention, large visioning initiatives at a regional level, for instance, that's Little Rock on the top left, to news at 11, high profile, high stakes situations that are very controversial, such as extending light rail that connected wealthy neighborhoods in St. Louis with the rest of the region. Heritage development, which is on the upper right and lower right, is tapping a community's culture. Let's see if this next one comes up. Yeah, heritage development is tapping a community's culture, its history, and its setting as assets and harnessing them strategically. My assignments have often been regional, because heritage is something that stretches across artificial jurisdictional lines. These pictures are from the management plan for the Blackstone River National Heritage Area that runs from Worcester, Mass. To Providence, Rhode Island. It's a very large example. And then a number of my clients have kept me on to coach them through the early implementation stages. Bethesda, Maryland's Urban Partnership in the lower left is one of those. Some of the lessons learned. There are three I want to share with you today. Start with the end in mind. Planning as a golden opportunity for community learning, and vision and story, overcoming inertia. The end isn't what comes because of the plan. It's easy to lose sight of this seemingly obvious fact, but too often we do. I've learned that as engineers start with soil borings to determine if there's sufficient foundation for a building, without an understanding of a community's attitudinal topography, its leadership, its culture, it's easy for plans to propose projects that are beyond its capacity. This usually ends in dashed hopes and yet another confirmation of the town's inner doubts. Instead, take the time to get the lay of the land beyond the obvious factors. That means talking with people. Rutland had an earned reputation for bickering, missing several once-in-a-generation opportunities because of it. Knowing this, and with another once-in-a-generation opportunity in hand, the city and its planning team started with what downtown meant to people in the area, what they longed for it to be. The overwhelming response overcame cynical elected officials, and they were truly cynical, skeptical property owners, and voters. It set the stage for a bolder plan, one that required creating the state's first business improvement district. And actually, voters did that. They created it. Fast forward, and downtown is a source of pride, what people had been yearning for, with events, new businesses, downtown living, and more. Whether you're a professional, such as the director of planning, or you're a business leader about to launch a civic visioning process and goal setting, the savvy planner knows that it's people who implement plans. It's people who make sure that when the elected officials are going to vote on the plan, supporters are present and prepared. It's people who persuade bankers to contribute to a loan pool, who pitch the legislature for funding for capital investment. So the savvy planner invests the upfront time to reach out and build relationships with as many of the community's critical players as possible. And even with the internet, face-to-face is the way to build those relationships. And then the savvy planner builds into the game plan appropriate ways of getting them engaged and keeping them informed at every stage of the way. We don't do civics much anymore. As we kind of have learned in the last couple of years, there's a price for not doing that. The average person only interacts with local government these days to pay taxes or to fight zoning, rezoning. Besides a few civically obsessed citizens, the majority of people are just not interested. But it benefits all, everyone, when enough people do pay attention, when they understand the benefits rather than their default setting of doing nothing. Their default setting is the human fear of its impact on them, whatever is being proposed. A well-conceived planning process can set the stage for momentum that can overcome inertia. It can and has changed communities. Think about elected officials for a moment, the decision makers. They're part of the public too. I learned this, and I learned that they have, very few of them have any grounding in planning and land use. Once after a work session with county commissioners in a southern community, it had gone really well. And we were loading up in the parking lot when one of the council members came out and cornered us and said, you know, I've been on this council for 9 years, and I've been on the zoning committee. In my day job, I'm an expert in childhood development, but tonight is the first time I've understood the link between our subdivision patterns and why there's so much traffic on Levels Road. Wow, this was an aha moment. And how could an elected official admit this in public? This one had not in the 9 years she'd been on the council. This is a very common condition. Well before decision time, and as various alternatives are being explored in your process, take the time to explain to them in lay terms what it could mean for their community. And don't think once is going to do it. Do this every time you're going to engage your community in planning. I found that most public agency planners gird their loins for trouble when even thinking about having to deal with a citizen advisory committee. Yes, it can be a pain. On the other hand, it can be the crucible for achieving real breakthroughs. Plans are about change, and we humans don't like change. Remember, back in the cave, change meant there's probably a saber-toothed tiger out there. So we've, over evolution, have developed a real bevy of change avoidance methods. You've seen a lot of them in action. Blaming others, making whatever the problem is about a personality, if only John would change. Defining the problem as technical, which meant we have to have another study, and then after that, another study. You know these, and there are many more, because you encounter them daily. These are resistance to the prospect of change out of fear. For communities to change, for your plan to really lead to lasting results, much learning has to take place. Think about it. Public engagement is episodic. It's not the same people at all the community meetings. They come and they go. But the advisory committee meets regularly, probably monthly. This is an invaluable learning opportunity. Savvy planners take the time to create an educated cadre of community leaders in their advisory committee. You know, for years, business schools have included what's called adaptive leadership as a core capacity. More planning schools should too. Ronald Heifetz was the pioneer in his wonderful book, still in print and should be on everybody's shelf, Leadership Without Easy Answers. In it, he explains the difference between problems that are technical and require it fairly easy to solve, and those that are much more complex and require transformation. Here's the difference. He uses a doctor as the example. Go to the doctor with an ache, and the doctor diagnoses it and says, take this pill and you'll feel better. That's really easy. You can do that. On the other hand, if the doctor says, you have to stop smoking, that's going to require you to really do a lot of adaptation. It's going to require you to work much harder over probably a longer period of time. Adaptive leadership requires a safe environment within which there's trust and learning can take place. Properly done, an advisory committee is potentially such a place. I'll give you two quick examples from my experience. I did a project with Emory University in Atlanta, and they had been constrained for years due to their relationship with a small group of preservation folks who did not want to see any change beyond the campus. And this, Emory was the second largest employer in the state and a vital part of the economy. By creating a larger community advisory committee that worked with Emory and including them in it, but having a lot more others with different perspectives, it greatly lessened the influence of NIMBYs and let us break through to develop an understanding that enabled wonderful projects to happen in a much more pedestrian-friendly environment around the campus. The other example is many, many years ago, Savannah and Chatham County, Georgia, had been experiencing a lot of rejection at the going for referenda for critical things. They needed to make some real changes, but number one is they needed to bring up a fresh new generation of leaders. The advisory committee itself, over the space of about 18 months, became, if you will, the incubator for the new mayor, several new council members, and a real breakthrough in how the community thought and how it was able to act. All of these examples work because the sponsor understood the need for more than just good plans. They needed a community that was ready and able to implement it. People need to see the familiar with a new lens and maybe replace their stereotyped images with fresh possibilities. I found field trips can be really important in helping to create new imagery and new opportunity. First of all, they can be great for an advisory committee, for instance, to bond together as they are on a bus tour of their area. They can also be a place where trust begins to happen and builds. And third, they can provide new insights that weren't there before. Here, the couple of examples here are on the learning new things. In Shreveport, we took the advisory committee on a Saturday bus tour of the whole community. Many of the business people, especially, had never been off their sort of gerbil trails back and forth from home to business, to the country club, etc. They'd never seen some of the neighborhoods and the really, really serious issues there. By the same token, some of the neighborhood people had really never seen some of the issues that were elsewhere. But it created a common understanding from which they were then able to understand some of the changes that were needed and being proposed. Public housing, everybody knows that that's a really bad thing. So that means that if you're going to have mixed use and it's going to have public housing units in it, that's something the neighbors should fight. Not if you take them to see what mixed housing, mixed income housing can look like and how it acts and what kind of neighborhoods it is. It's made a huge difference because it plants another vision and another story of what is going to happen, what's there. I'm going to end with something where even I was skeptical when it was first proposed. I was part of the team that worked on the citywide plan for New Orleans in 2010, a few years after the Katrina. The citywide plan called for the removal of the elevated Claiborne Expressway, which had basically blasted through neighborhoods, dividing them, and it scarred New Orleans. Calling for its removal and its replacement with a boulevard seemed beyond belief. It was daunting. But the plan included some first steps. Apply for a small grant to study X. When you know that, you can apply for another grant to study Y. They did, and they continued with these small baby steps. Today, it's the centerpiece of President Biden's infrastructure and jobs bill. They were ready when the time was right, and they're now about to get started, we hope. I have one final question for you before we move on to discussion.
Okay, and this is a question we often ask, is where you're joining us from today? West, Midwest, Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or beyond the USA? We occasionally get folks there. We'll leave this open a little bit. Thanks for those of you who are responding. Looks like we have representation from everywhere.
Well, I've got one final question for you before we move to, well, we're doing it now, but looking back, I've learned a lot by doing, and you will too. I'm hoping that even those of you who are not comfortable with process, who find it tedious and draining, will take the time to look at it through a different lens, because people are the hidden and too obvious ingredient in successful plans. Thank you for your time and your questions, and I am always asked, where can I get your book? So the marketer in me is giving you that information.
So before we do that, Mary, we're sharing the poll results. And so today,
Okay.
41% are from the Mid-Atlantic, 19 Southeast, 17 Midwest, 15% from the West, and 8% international. So quite a
That's
diversity.
fantastic. Fantastic.
So thanks everybody for joining us. So I don't know if you want to put that link back up for us, Mary, and where to get your book.
Yes.
Because I
There it
understand
is.
this is self-published, is that correct?
It is, and you can get it through Amazon, but really that would be ridiculous considering the subject matter.
Understood. Okay, well, we'll ask you to turn your webcam on and we'll go into the Q&A. And thanks to everybody who has submitted questions already. You can continue to ask the questions or submit questions, and we'll stay till about 2:30 or so, or until we run out of questions. So for this, I guess we'll start with a question from Jane Matthews, who's asking, saying, I'm in a larger city, so there are multiple little pre-war commercial centers. Can they all be main streets?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that? I was dealing with technology here at my end.
Sure, understood. So our questioner says that she's in a larger city with multiple little pre-war commercial centers. Can they all be main streets?
Well, I think some of them can. I would never say all, because some of that depends on the local leadership and the desire to be. This is not, I think the whole approach to Main Street revitalization is not something that can be imposed from outside. It's something that the seeds have to be planted, and people need to really want to do it. Places like Boston, which has 22 Main Street districts, the District of Columbia has about 18. Chicago has quite a number. And there are some in California and other places that have been along more in more suburban environments than these kind of nice and compact ones I was showing in the pictures. So yes, it is possible to do that. I think one of the issues is that we did not have to address with freestanding Main Street communities is the competition is just next door. If you're trying to do multiple sites in the same area, which means that there's some tension there, and the political components of it can be more complex. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Mary. The next question is from Vaughn Polar, who's asking, what are the types of business sectors that are thriving in Main Street programs? My area's retail market was saturated before the pandemic, and I fear we will lag in the recovery.
Well, you know, there's retail and there's retail. And there's no question that the country, the common belief is the country was oversaturated with retail. It was oversaturated, my friends and experts, Michael Byrne and others tell me that it was oversaturated with certain kinds of retail, the kind of more mass market things. Main Street has, on the whole, has tended to have a more niche audience. I mean, one of the things we learned is by looking at the untapped asset of the character of place that was there in nice main streets that just needed to be revealed and brought up, is that it's a good location for things that can, for businesses that can benefit from being in that kind of a location. So special shops, arts, things that are not easy to find, restaurants, it's all going to be a different world as we come out of the pandemic. There's been such a lot of damage done to the things that have been our activity generators. The arts, performances, live performances, museums, things that are attractors that bring people to an area. And restaurants, of course, have become part of our way of reanimating a place. And it remains to be seen how much of that is going to return quickly. But I'm pretty confident that a lot of it is going to return. It's just not going to return immediately.
Thanks, Mary. I guess a kind of a related question here from Lynn Thomas, who's saying, I believe the growth of online shopping is an opportunity to decrease the amount of land zoned commercially and to prioritize downtowns to maintain a large percentage of communities' commercial zoning. However, what do we do with the other non-downtown areas in terms of zoning if we do downzone a significant part of our community?
Well, that of course would vary from community to community, but I'll give you an example from nearby. This is of course it would be different from a hot market area versus a pretty stagnant market area. But I've been seeing a number of large parcels like dead strip centers, because they're under sole ownership and therefore you don't have the complex property assembly. And if there's a market for mixed use, we certainly have a great pent-up demand for affordable housing. And that can be possible in a mixed use, mixed income redevelopment of some of those areas. That would be the first thing that would spring to my mind.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Next question here is, given that many communities throughout the country have stripped commercial auto-oriented development corridors, do you have suggestions on how we can revitalize and redevelop those aging corridors using the Main Street model?
I think some of the things that I would not say that the Main Street model is directly applicable to that. I do think that the lessons that are behind it, such as you can't just, in my book, you can't just say the solution is a design solution or the solution is recruit new businesses. And it's going to have to be sort of fine-tuned for the place. But the idea is that these four categories of activity, design, promotion, organization, and economic vitality, all need to be part of an approach to your place, whether it's suburban or not. And certainly creating a more pedestrian environment, probably in nodes, because they are automobile centric and they have been built that way, but they can certainly be made to be a great deal less chaotic visually than they are, and they can be made to be a lot more pedestrian friendly, perhaps in nodes. But I think if you, it was never intended that a community would take the Main Street approach, the 4 points, and basically say, this is exactly what we're going to do. It's a conceptual framework, and it helps those who are active in revitalization, I think about the complexity of it in ways that are appropriate to that location. I'd also jump in to say that someone asked me recently about the changing demographics of the country and how there are neighborhoods that really reflect the arrivals. And my favorite example of this is Pilsen in Chicago. I lived in Chicago for a long time. And I watched an area that had been settled by European from the Czechoslovakia and the area that's now Czechoslovakia, with buildings that kind of reflected that, become the heart of the Mexican-American community. And the overlay of murals and signage and cuisine and everything else was just amazingly rich. It would be a real shame in areas that have shopping areas that reflect the cultures of the folks who live there to come in and say, this looks messy and we have to clean it all up. It's like we need to really take our signals from the culture that's there and the culture that it's hoped is going to come there and do business. So don't think the whole thing is to just let's clean it up. You may be wiping out terrific culture and pissing a lot of people off.
That's a good point. A couple folks have asked about the name of the Kennedy Smith document. Can you repeat that for us again?
I think it's, let me go back. I think it's Now, Then, and Later.
Okay. If we can find a link, we'll share that with the audience today. Next question here is from Danielle Fontaine, who's asking, beyond the obvious restaurants, what types of businesses have you found are the most successful on revitalized main streets?
Oh boy, that's going to vary. There are places that draw a lot of their patrons from a region that they're not from that town or that community, that come there because they are attracted to a collection of things. There's enough to do there to warrant driving several hours to spend time there or to spend a weekend there. And that's kind of a tourism market, but it's not entirely. And the businesses that'll do well in an environment like that are the kinds of things that are probably impulse purchases, but that are not really, you can't find in most places. They might be regional crafts or regional foods and things like that, and certainly restaurants that are that have something going for them that's not just a place to eat. Performance is another big attraction. When there are events that have live music or venues that have live music or live performance, it can act as a big factor in generating the kinds of traffic that retailers need to survive or to thrive. I hope that answers it. If not, pose a second one.
Okay. Well, we have many more questions, so I'm sure we'll approach that from some other angles. So the next question is from Jonah Martin, who's asking, have you been tracking slow streets and parklet initiatives during the pandemic? And do you think that these will be used to revitalize main streets that have been particularly difficult to reinvent or revitalize?
Let me say that in terms of following, that would be a really active verb. I've been more than glancing at, and I've been intrigued in reports from Next City and places like that of examples of, and from Project for Public Spaces and others, of examples where these have become much more positive contributors to their community than the parking space that it replaced. And consequently, there is a great interest in keeping them. I think I think one of the good things that's coming out of the pandemic is that because it was a crisis, it enabled us to fast forward some things that would have taken forever to get through local governments. I lived in Old Town Alexandria for many years, and about 4 weeks after the pandemic shutdown started, I happened to be there, and I was absolutely, my jaw dropped, because you could never have convinced me that the city of Alexandria would allow outdoor dining in what had been parking spaces in its old town. But it had. It just acted quickly, and now everyone is really liking it. So I think we're going to see more of that, and we're also going to see something that's been growing for a while, which is people are seeking out places to live that don't require you to have an automobile. So we're seeing, already we were seeing parking requirements, the minimum parking requirements for new development sort of become more right-sized and addressing the potential for walking or car sharing and things like that. So there may not be the kind of need for as much on-street parking as we had before. At the same time, I don't want us to go overboard with this, because I think I would imagine that a study that we did many, many years ago at the Main Street Center would probably still find relevance today. We wrote a little publication with Project for Public Spaces called What Do People Do Downtown? And we did observations and surveys of how people use the parking spaces, the metered parking spaces in a downtown, and graphed out how quickly the turnover was. And we found that, an example, if you wanted to open a dry cleaner, you would be really well advised to find a building that was right next to a fire hydrant, because going to a dry cleaner involves pulling up, going in, coming back out, and that can all be done before the meter maid gets there and tickets you for being next to the fire hydrant. It was the most valuable parking space on the street. So there are reasons that on-street parking is really required for retail to succeed, but maybe not necessarily as much as we think there is. It's also a really important thing to have the kind of vitality of people being able to see people having a good time downtown. And these little parklets and outdoor dining modules really seem to project that every place I visited in the last year, which has not been far, but I've visited a lot online.
Thanks, Mary. Next question here is from one of our colleagues in Maryland, Wendy Erminger of Prince George's County, who's asking, looking forward regarding the role of historic preservation, do you sense that historic preservation is playing a more important, less important, or the same level of importance to Main Street revitalization?
Well, it's really interesting. It's a really good question. For the longest, the world of preservation sort of organized historic preservation and preservation professionals, I think didn't really see Main Street revitalization and these Main Street programs as preservation. It was sort of something over there. It wasn't pure enough. And we were tolerant of things that, an example, it used to be that preservationists would fight like crazy if you proposed planting street trees because there hadn't been any to begin with. This is a more flexible world we live in. I think to me, the most exciting thing for me about receiving the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Crown and Shield Award last year was that it finally was the preservation arena acknowledging that Main Street was preservation. I do think that we can tend to have an eye about preservation that says it's seeking perfection, or it's far too regulatory. I don't think it's too regulatory, but I do think that sometimes the attitudes about it can get in its own way. I was very pleased to see recently that the University of Pennsylvania's graduate program in preservation has been doing some survey work about what people are thinking about where the preservation field is right now. I think Place Economics, a really wonderful market economics group that focuses on preservation environments, is also doing some survey work in this direction. I think the historic preservation movement is at I wouldn't call it an inflection point. That's probably a little bit too concrete, but it's at a point where it's evolving into something that is more about, as much about story and the history and the culture of places than it was 25, 30 years ago. It's getting beyond just a focus on the physical.
Thanks, Mary. Next question here is from Bill Pritchard, who's asking, is there a minimum or maximum size for an area to be undertaken to survive long-term?
Well, remind me, Michael, if I forget this question by a divergence here. I can remember when I first started to work at the National Register of Historic Places many years ago, and the National Register was for places of national, state, or local significance to be recognized. And we grappled with that question of local significance. What does it mean? And in my book, it means people care enough about it to want to preserve it. So I've been really surprised at communities that have been so small that and isolated that I would never have thought they had a future. And yet they had some people who believed in them and who found a niche and who were able to do that. So in a way, it can succeed in places that are pretty small if the leadership and will is there to try to do something with it. I've been amazed at Iowa, for instance, as we've seen the industrialization of agriculture all over the Midwest kind of remove the great numbers of family farms that were there, small ones, and they needed communities for commerce, small towns. I've been really amazed to see how many of the small communities of Iowa are still there. And one of the reasons is they have a Main Street program that has scores of them that have been working, even in places as small as 300 or 400 people. It's going to depend on the people locally and the kind of support they get within a state system that recognizes it. I hope I didn't stray too far from what the questioner was asking.
Well, if there's a follow-up, I'll let you know.
But let me jump in, because I think included in that was, is there a place that's too big? Not really. Not if Boston and Chicago can find areas within them along, usually along former streetcar lines, to have Main Street districts and operate them as though they're, to the greatest extent possible, like a Main Street effort. So it can work in larger cities. It's just a very different, it's a more challenging environment.
Understood. Okay, next question is from Nick Helmholtz, who's asking or saying that our downtown and Main Street area is off the main highway and to the uninitiated a bit difficult to find. How beneficial have you found vehicular wayfinding signage is to Main Street success?
I think in places like yours, the one you described, it could be really, really important. I'd also want to say that doing something that tests out where they should be located and what they should say is probably a good idea before getting into it too big. When I lived in Old Town Alexandria, and I've seen this also in Annapolis, there are places to park, but you'd have no idea where they are because everybody's been so preservation concerned, they kind of hidden the parking garages. But when you put up signs that say parking here and a wayfinding system that points people to them, it certainly increases the usability of the whole area.
Okay, thank you. Next question is also related to the pandemic. You've been talking about the return of retail. However, the pandemic has sent many office workers home. Anticipating a likely hybrid model where folks will be able to work predominantly remotely, what changes do you anticipate relative to our offices and workers like me, who used to populate the downtown? Is downtown office space dead?
It appears that there's a great issue here because it is unlikely that those who have been working at home or have been able and privileged enough to be able to work at home are already showing that they really have no desire to fully return to a 5-day-a-week downtown location. And it's definitely impacting the downtowns of major cities. Here in Washington, D.C., the downtown area has been, the retail and the restaurants have been severely hit with this. I think it's going to take a while to shake out for larger cities. But I know that for the areas that are small commercial areas nearby that are walkable, you're used to going to a coffee shop or are used to going out, and we still are needing these places that are perhaps walkable or a short drive that are a way to break the day and to connect with friends and connect with colleagues in what I'd call everybody else has called third places, the coffee shops and things like that. So it's going to be a different kind of food and beverage and a different kind of retailing, and it's going to be more distributed, I think, than concentrated in the downtown area. That said, when you have something like a sports arena and the restaurants that serve at sports arena, and we get back into full tilt operations of things, activities that are going on in these big attractions, that is going to keep some of our larger cities, those areas, beating somewhat stronger. I'm not sure. It's certainly not my area of expertise, and I'll tell you, it's a good time to be retired from the consulting field right now. I have little to bring to that.
I hear you, Mary. We did get a comment while you were speaking. It's a matter of opinion. Can't wait to get back to the office. I do not like working from home, too isolating and quiet. So obviously a number of people are interested in getting back into these places.
I can imagine. I can imagine. It felt so good to join friends for lunch the other day, face to face. I've had both of my shots, and as have they. But it was the first time in a year that I had worn real clothes below the Zoom line, and neither of my friends had either. So it was just like a great, let's get back together again and reconnect. And I think there's going to be a lot of that.
In fact, the commenter just said that perhaps we could poll the audience to see if people would prefer to be back in the office or work from home. It'd be interesting to see that response from this group today.
That really would. That really would. In fact, if you guys have got the opportunity to pop that one up, it would be very interesting.
Well, John heard that, so if he can, he'll let me know. We'll
Okay.
do it later. Okay, next question here is, do you have any advice on how you get your local elected officials engaged into the formation of a Main Street program?
Well, two things. I think a field trip is really a wonderful learning experience. And if there's anyone nearby to do that, I also think these are great opportunities. A field trip can be a great place to kind of unleash the competitive DNA in many people. So getting them to see a successful or a couple of successful Main Street places and having someone who knows about it, give them a tour of it so they're not just looking at what is the surface of it, but someone who is explaining to them what it took to get it to this point, so that they can then get some three-dimensional understanding of it. I think that's a good way to do it. The other is, most times a town's central business district is its highest value from a tax base standpoint. And if it's not performing well, it's impacting city finances. So that having higher property values and more sales tax and more activity going on there is going to have a direct benefit on the city. And thirdly, these days, most younger workers who are educated and can live anywhere they want to choose to work where they want to live. And my recent example of this is I did some work for Wichita, Kansas, and their downtown had potential, but it was really very flat. And they were really very much wanting to get the heads of several of the big aviation companies. You guys may know Wichita is sort of the capital of airplane manufacturing. And those big places obviously needed huge parcels of land, so they were nowhere near downtown. So how do we get those business leaders to get involved and understand the importance of it? And the case was made to them, look, you are competing internationally for the best talent in aeronautical engineering that you can find. And these days, young people really look for places that have cool places to hang out, the ability to live downtown, entertainment, all of those kinds of things, downtown housing. And Wichita has none of that. And Seattle, which is where one of your biggest competitors is, has lots of that. So we are working in the downtown to try to change this, and it's in your own best interest to participate in it. Wham, all of a sudden they're on board. They really got it. So it's kind of, I think, making the case for what their unrealized vested interest might be in having a revitalized downtown.
Thanks, Mary. Next question here is from Hannah Blake, who's saying, can you provide some community-led research and survey tools and best practices to understand the market and planning needs of a Main Street? Books, for example, survey examples, technology, crowdsourced or not. She also says, congratulations on your award.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I can't, but the first thing I'd say is buy my book, but that's because it's got a really good bibliography. But more importantly, the National Main Street Center is a phenomenal resource. You can reach it at just Google National Main Street Center, it'll pop right up. I would encourage everyone who's interested in any of these subjects to go there, because over the last 4 or 5 years prior to the pandemic, but now greatly accelerated by the pandemic, the Main Street Center has become an amazing resource in terms of all of those kinds of things. It's running some surveys itself and producing some really important data and information. And it's produced a lot of publications and training materials. It's an absolute wealth. And it isn't all kind of, I think some skeptics may think that the Main Street approach is a formulaic thing. It's broken way loose of formulas lately, folks, and it's now a set of organizing principles. It seems to have really worked in a lot of places, and the resources that are available just kind of cover the universe of anything downtown.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Gloria Del Greco, who says, a state highway is going to be enlarged and will take out a building on the historic register. We are working to get it moved, but we're worried that it will destroy our historic designation. Any advice on what we can do?
If the state highway has federal funds in it, I'm guessing it's become it's subject to Section 106 review, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and it's also subject to 4F of the Transportation Act. So there's a review process for it. You probably already know that. If it's just a state highway and there aren't any federal funds involved in it, you may be fortunate in living in a state that has taken those same requirements and put them onto state-funded projects as well. I don't know what it'll do about the official designation of your community as a historic district. What it sounds like it will do, though, is change the character of that part of your historic district. And not knowing how big it is, it sounds like it's pretty prominent if it's on a corner. That could be really important. And it might be part of, if it's inevitable that there's going to be some change brought by the state highway, maybe negotiating to get some mitigation that would help create a space, or rather create around it something, some form of building or whatever that kind of reflects and transitions into the scale of the historic district would be an important thing to go for. And you might even want to go for some mitigation that would involve help with recovering. I worked with a town in Pennsylvania once that was going to get a bridge replaced, that was going to they were going to leave the old bridge in place, but they were building a new bridge, and the old bridge was just going to be pedestrian. And we were successful in getting the state highway department to put a bunch of money into a Main Street program for the town, because this was going to be bypassing the established Main Street. And they actually paid for like 4 or 5 years of a Main Street manager and that kind of thing, coming out of the state transportation money.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Gloria has responded with saying that they've opted out of the federal funds it is in, but perhaps Gloria can contact you directly to follow up as we kind of move on to other questions.
Sure, that's fine.
So here's another one. I'd be interested in your opinion if you think it's important to attract a grocery store to a main street. Most grocery stores have moved out of downtown. There's a real challenge to attract one and be on the main street.
Well, a couple of things. Grocery stores take a minimum amount of floor space, and they need it configured in a way that may not be conducive to the floor footprints of older buildings. On the other hand, former department stores, former things that are large, have that kind of floor plate. But the grocery store companies tend to have their own idea about what constitutes an acceptable location. And you're going to have to make a case on that. And it's going to be market oriented and access. And a barrier that you're going to need to really look at is what are lenders' perceptions? Often the financing of a place, of a development, it makes sense in our book to have a grocery store downtown, but it may not make sense in the lender's sort of limited vocabulary that says you have to have tons of parking in front of it, blah, 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 blah. And that might rule out some grocery company from coming in. I have seen examples where the community got together and made a strong case, did market studies and everything, and took them to a grocer that they really wanted to come in, and really made a strong enough case that it worked. It's rare, but it worked. And the other thing I'd ask is, does it have to be on Main Street, or does it just need to be downtown so that it can provide the activity generating that a grocery store can generate? And I was reading the other day where grocery stores are kind of declining a little bit. They need less space, so maybe that'll work for you on Main Street because they do need less space, some of them.
Okay, thank you. Next question here. Someone is saying, I live in a city that is large, well over 500,000 people, with a downtown that has not been a destination. In fact, the downtown pales compared to many cities 1/10 that size. I'm not a planner in this community, but do you have any suggestions about how to kickstart some Main Street enhancements? I do know a number of planners and other officials in the city.
I think without knowing a little bit more than that, I'm going to be tossing darts at a wall, not even a target right here, but maybe some of them would hit. I'd want to start with a small section of your downtown, maybe a block or two, and I'd want to see what could happen there. And I might want to get some folks to turn out to, what do I want to say? A little design, a community design process that might work on those couple of blocks with what it might be, and see if one could get something going that might make a difference there. But again, I'm going to return to the idea of field trips. What got things going in Wichita, and I know it's gotten things going in a number of other places, is you know how the regional chambers generally do the sort of city trip where everybody from St. Louis goes off to Seattle, all the top folks, and they go off for several days and meet with their peers and learn how they really manage to do something, and they come back. These happen all the time. And often they bring back ideas that are really good, and they've kind of broken through their own inhibitors by seeing someplace in action. I'm told that someone in Wichita, knowing the effect that something like this could have, and knowing that the downtown really needed to have a kickstart, got the chamber to sponsor a trip to a pre-selected location that could serve as a really good model for this. And everybody went off and saw it. And on the way back, they're all going, my God, if Oklahoma City can do this, we really have to do something. They're going to eat our lunch. And voila, the private sector, the banks, the bigger businesses kicked in money and asked the city to match it. And they came up with a very significant chest of funds that enabled them to do the kind of study that brought Wichita to where it is today. So I hate to say, even in an internet age where Google Maps and Google Earth can take you anywhere, it's not the same as having peers together, experiencing something, hearing the stories of their peers in that town, and then kind of germinating with it and coming home and seeing what they can do with it. I think these things have been very valuable.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Next question here is from Rod Profit, who says that his town of Pagosa Springs is updating its land use code. Has Main Street taken a position on a preferable type of zoning? I've been advocating for form-based zoning without much success. So I'd like to know just where this falls from your experience.
I'm not a zoning expert, and there may be a couple of them at the National Main Street Center. So I can't offer you one or the other on it. I do think that the form base has a lot more applicability in places that have a lot of character, because you're also more concerned about the shape and fit of things than you are about the uses that are going in them. Although you should not be, don't turn away from some of the uses that you want to make sure are not able to come in. But yeah, I can't really answer that as a zoning expert.
Understood. And we've done other sessions on zoning issues, so possibly there's something in the webinar archives that'd be relevant to that. Next question here is from Spencer Gobert, who is saying, as former malls reinvent themselves as mixed-use lifestyle centers, Will Main Street lose its competitive edge? And if so, what can Main Street do to compete?
Well, I think that's going to depend on where the mall is, or the reborn, the dead but reborn mall, and where the main streets are, and what the market is like in the area. It's going to vary quite differently in places that are hot market areas versus those that are more isolated and have less competition. I'll tell you I won't say it's my favorite example of a repurposed mall, but there's one in Shreveport that was a Simon Mall, and Simon built another one not too close and couldn't do anything with this one. So it either sold or gave it to a church. And there's a mega church that now occupies the entire shopping center, former mall. And one of the department stores is its sanctuary. They put a steeple on it. And it's the only church I know that has absolutely no parking problems on Sunday. They used a portion of it for their to open a school, and it's really kind of amazing. That doesn't help your tax base. A mixed use and mixed income area would do a much better job. Plus, you could put in streets to create a much more walkable environment, streets and landscaping to create a more walkable environment. I think there's probably room for both in terms of retail, but you need to turn to retail market experts rather than me.
And we may actually be doing one in a couple of weeks on that retail topic. So stay tuned for people in the audience.
I didn't hear that myself.
Yes. Next question here is from John Cartmill, who says, can you talk about the role for mass transit to get people to and from Main Street without cars?
Ooh, a great question. When I hear mass transit, I think urban. I think really big city. I don't think things like car sharing or bicycles or other forms of transportation. But I think that having a good transit system, and of course there are big questions about this, what with the impact of the pandemic on our country's transit systems, our public transit systems. But given that we can have it, and given that Mary gets to put it wherever she wants to, Mary would want to put it in a way that connected nodes of retail and entertainment and commercial activity that are also have livable living space, be able to connect that all across the region. I don't believe that we're going to divorce people from their cars, but I do know that a younger generation is coming up that greatly prefers not to have to own a car. In fact, many who can't afford to own a car because their student loan load is so high. And those are the folks who would be likely to be attracted to places that are served by transit. Not to mention those of us who are up in years and want not to drive anymore or are unable to drive anymore. And those are markets that definitely need to be served too. I'm just hoping that public transit remains really viable in the next 5 to 10 years. It's really gotten a kick in the teeth with the pandemic, at least in the Washington metropolitan area and other big cities.
That's certainly true. Okay, we'll have a couple more questions. We are getting close to 2:30 Eastern, so we'll wrap up soon. And thanks to everybody who has been submitting all these great questions. We always have more questions than we have time for. And thanks to Mary for fielding all of these. So the next one is, how can you get developers to focus on Main Street instead of outlying areas? I was on a local planning commission and zoning board, and half the members were in favor of development anywhere, no restrictions on locations. In slower economies and small towns, I'm in Vermont, small towns are desperate for anything.
Well, you're lucky in Vermont. I think you still have Act 250, which most states don't have. I think there are two things. There are developers who specialize in infill and rehabilitation kinds of projects. And there are developers who their niche is really building freestanding commercial strip, those kinds of things. And to try to get them to switch over is difficult because they have their own established financing conduits that have their own priorities or their own kind of template for what constitutes something that is bankable, a term I learned from my CNU friends. So I can't really tell you how you can stop particularly in a place that is saying it's desperate for the income from it. I'm guessing that you're speaking of they're desperate for tax base and also desperate for jobs. Those jobs don't tend to pay what people would really think of as livable. And I'm wondering about the impact on the overall tax base if you spread it out and have the high cost of serving public services to things that are really distributed, that are, the cost of providing fire service, of water, of sewer, all of that is much less when you're in a compact area that has already got a lot of that infrastructure in place. I know a couple of the public utility companies early on really got behind, electric utility companies really got behind the Main Street Revitalization movement, because think about it, their infrastructure is all there in the older city. They've got all those wires, all those transmission, everything. And when the lights are out or low, it's not working for them. And turning the lights back on and bringing activity really helped their market share. So they jumped on right away. And I think similarly, some arguments could be made with elected officials that getting greater productivity out of the already developed area makes a great deal more sense. Now, two big issues there. One is land assembly, and the other is community opposition or community acceptance. And this comes back to, and you saw I used the Rutland example. This comes back to getting people aligned in such a fashion that they can see that the community acceptance part of it is not going to be a barrier to the developer you would like to attract to a more built-up area. The built-up areas can sometimes have a lot of NIMBYs who don't deal well with change and don't want to see any of it come. And as long as the elected officials haven't created a wide enough platform to hear a lot of voices, and all they're hearing about at the town meeting is what I've long ago called the civically obsessed, who are no to anything, then they certainly get the idea that the entire community is not in favor of this, and Lord knows we need the tax base, so we better say yes to the guy that's out there where no one's complaining about living next door to a commercial building. I'm giving you a rambling answer, but I think I'm running out of steam at this point. You guys have asked some great questions. I really, really enjoyed this. I hope it's been useful to those who have spent an hour and a half with us.
We're getting very good comments also in the questions as well. So we'll share that all with you afterward. I guess last question here before we wrap up is from one of our audience members who says, I've really enjoyed your presentation and never realized the value of advisory committees. But she's wondering, what keeps you up at night today?
Oh boy, not much at my age. No, I think what has kept me up a lot is where the country, how divided the country is, and how much the pandemic has kind of accelerated some of our divisions. I was thrilled to see the verdict that was handed down yesterday, because the response to George Floyd's murder last summer, I think, was a pivotal point in our nation's history. I hope it is. And it's been wonderful to see the embrace of the idea that we're going to have to learn to overcome what we thought was our perfect union. And we're going to have to address a number of our racial disconnects. And that keeps me up, and it also gives me hope. And what really gave me the hope was last summer, seeing how many white people were showing up at these protests and how they wouldn't go away. The protests wouldn't go away, and they were also taking place in small towns, which were predominantly white, and they were involving people of all ages saying enough is enough. We have to see each other as humans and work together as humans. That is what I would say. That's the kind of stuff that causes me not to worry quite as much as I was a year ago. So we all keep it up, because ours is a multicultural world. It has been for a long time, and it's getting more so. And it adds to the richness of American culture to have that happen. We need to make sure that there is room in the playing fields of our main streets and our towns for all to get a fair chance at the American dream, which is making a good living, making sure your kids do as well or better than you did, and taking care of each other. So on that, I want to thank everybody who's asked some wonderful questions, and stay in touch.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. With that, we'll wrap up today. And wanted to, thank you, conclude our webinar, Looking Back and Looking Ahead, 4 Decades of Lessons Learned from Main Street and Beyond. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Mary Means for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox from details on other future webinars, including 2 upcoming programs, including What is a Walkability Study and Why Should You Do One, with Jeff Speck next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're excited to have Jeff back. And Equity in Policy and Practice, Addressing Past Inequities and Planning for the Future, with the American Planning Association, which will be next Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So we'll have a busy week with you all next week. With that, I wish you all a great day.